You're standing in a gilded ballroom, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and swirling silk. The orchestra plays, champagne flows, and suddenly, urgently, nature calls. You glance down at the architectural monstrosity you're wearing. 6 layers of petticoats, a steel cage spanning 6 feet in diameter, 20 pounds of fabric cinched around a corset that's literally reshaped your ribcage. The nearest proper toilet is a fantasy that won't exist for another generation. You have approximately 3 minutes to solve a problem that requires the precision of a surgeon, the discretion of a spy, and the flexibility of a contortionist. Welcome to every Victorian woman's nightmare, the moment when biology collides with fashion, and losing means social death. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from today. Leave a comment with your city or country. It genuinely amazes me that we can share these intimate, uncomfortable truths about the past from every corner of the globe. This is England and America throughout the Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901, an age that history remembers for its prudishness, its obsession with propriety, and its spectacularly impractical approach to women's clothing. The crinoline, that cage of steel hoops that turned women into walking architectural wonders, dominated fashion from the 1850s through the 1870s, creating a daily crisis that society refused to acknowledge in polite conversation, but that consumed enormous amounts of female ingenuity, servant labor, and strategic planning. Surviving letters, household manuals, and the quietly mortified accounts of ladies' maids reveal a world where answering nature's most basic call became an elaborate performance requiring planning, assistance, and no small amount of courage. The question isn't just how Victorian women used the toilet in those giant dresses. It's how they maintained their sanity, their dignity, and their health while society demanded they pretend the entire problem didn't exist. The morning routine alone was an ordeal that modern women would find incomprehensible. It began around dawn with a lady's maid helping her mistress into the first layer, a thin linen chemise that protected expensive outer garments from direct skin contact. Then came the corset, a contraption of whalebone, steel, and unforgiving laces that took 2 people to properly tighten. The maid would brace her knee against her mistress's back and pull, cinching the waist down by inches until breathing became a shallow, deliberate exercise. Medical records from the period document women whose lower ribs had permanently curved inward, whose internal organs had shifted position, whose fainting spells were so routine that smelling salts became a fashion accessory. Over the corset came the petticoats, sometimes as many as 7 layers, each adding volume and weight. But the real engineering marvel, the piece that defined the silhouette and created the logistical nightmare, was the crinoline. Introduced in the 1850s as a liberating alternative to the 6 heavy petticoats women had been wearing, the crinoline was a cage made of graduated steel hoops connected by vertical fabric tapes. At its base, it could measure 6 feet across. Some of the more extreme versions used in formal court presentations extended even wider, requiring women to enter rooms sideways and making sitting in normal chairs physically impossible. Furniture makers responded by designing special crinoline chairs with no arms and extra-wide seats. Doorways in wealthy homes were widened. Carriage designs were modified. The weight of the full ensemble chemise, corset, petticoats, crinoline, and the dress itself with its yards of silk, velvet, or brocade could reach 25 pounds. Women essentially carried the weight of a toddler around their hips all day, every day. Walking required careful calculation. The hoops bounced and swayed with each step, threatening to flip upward in a gust of wind or when ascending stairs. Sitting demanded precise choreography. A woman had to press the front of her skirt down while lowering herself onto a seat, otherwise the back would spring up and expose her legs. Standing up required the reverse maneuver, performed with the same balletic grace society expected in all things feminine. And through all of this elaborate armor of respectability, biology continued its relentless demands. The bladder doesn't care about fashion. The menstrual cycle doesn't pause for propriety. The human digestive system operates on its own schedule, indifferent to steel hoops and social expectations. Victorian women found themselves trapped between two opposing forces: their bodies' undeniable needs and society's absolute refusal to acknowledge those needs existed. The chamber pot became the central character in this daily drama, though, like everything else related to bodily functions, it was never discussed openly. These weren't the crude pottery vessels of earlier centuries. Victorian chamber pots were specifically engineered for the dress crisis, with oval shapes designed to nestle between layers of fabric and curved interiors that allowed for proper positioning without requiring women to see what they were doing. The better models featured tight-fitting lids that served dual purposes, containing odors and signaling to servants whether the pot required emptying. In wealthy households, these essential items were concealed inside specially designed furniture. Bedside tables contained hidden compartments. Elegant chairs featured cunningly disguised seats that lifted to reveal the pot beneath. Elaborate wooden commodes draped with fabric disguised their true purpose as decorative side tables. The process itself required skills that mothers taught daughters in hushed, embarrassed conversations that survive in a handful of private letters and diaries. A woman couldn't simply lift her skirts. We're talking about steel hoops that maintained their shape regardless of what the fabric above them was doing. Instead, she had to master a technique that involved carefully positioning the chamber pot beneath the front edge of her crinoline, then using subtle shifts of weight and posture to settle over it without disturbing the outer appearance of her dress. The oval shape of the pot was crucial. It had to fit in the relatively narrow space between the forward-facing hoops while remaining stable enough for use. The entire operation had to be completed without removing any layers of clothing, because the time required to undress and redress was prohibitive, and the assistance needed would have meant admitting to servants exactly what was happening. Here's where the engineering gets even more intricate, and where Victorian ingenuity reaches levels that seem almost impossible. For most of the crinoline era, many women didn't wear what we'd recognize as underwear. The massive volume of petticoats and the crinoline cage itself were considered sufficient coverage. But this created obvious problems: modesty issues when the wind caught those steel hoops, hygiene concerns, and the practical difficulty of managing monthly bleeding beneath all those layers. The solution, when it finally arrived in the 1860s, was revolutionary: split crotch drawers. These weren't modern panties with a convenient opening. They were two entirely separate pant legs connected only at the waistband, with a gap measuring anywhere from 6 to 12 inches running from front to back. The design was pure genius for its specific purpose. It provided coverage when needed, preventing the embarrassing exposure incidents that had plagued women during the early crinoline years, but the split construction meant that women could use chamber pots without removing or even adjusting their undergarments. The opening was positioned precisely to align with the oval chamber pot below, creating a system that, once mastered, allowed for relative efficiency in an otherwise impossible situation. But efficiency is relative when you're managing this process during a 6-hour dinner party. At formal events, wealthy homes featured special retiring rooms, the Victorian equivalent of luxury restroom lounges, staffed with ladies' maids who functioned like highly trained pit crews. These rooms were carefully positioned near ballrooms and dining rooms, close enough for quick access but far enough that sounds wouldn't carry to public spaces. The maids working these rooms became experts in the silent choreography of assistance, positioning the pot, arranging the layers of fabric, maintaining absolute discretion, and ensuring that when a lady returned to the ballroom, nothing in her appearance suggested where she'd been or what she'd been doing. The logistics extended far beyond the mechanics of the act itself. Consider the reality of hygiene in an era without modern toilet paper. The first commercially produced toilet paper wasn't widely available until the 1880s, and even then it was considered a luxury item that many people viewed with suspicion. Before that, people used whatever was available and affordable. For working-class families, this meant old newspapers, pages torn from catalogs, corn cobs, handfuls of leaves, or strips of rag paper. For wealthy Victorian ladies, the preferred option was soft linen cloths, small squares that could be laundered along with other household linens and reused indefinitely. These cloths had to be carefully maintained by servants, washed in privacy, and stored discreetly where they'd be available when needed, but never visible to visitors. The monthly reality of menstruation added another layer of complexity that Victorian society absolutely refused to acknowledge. Women managed their periods using homemade cloth pads held in place by a system called the sanitary belt, essentially a cloth strap that tied around the waist with attachments at front and back to secure the absorbent materials. These materials varied by class and region: soft rags, cotton batting, sheep's wool, moss, even sawdust wrapped in cloth. Women had to change these makeshift pads frequently, sometimes as often as every 2 hours during heavy flow days. Every single change required the same elaborate process of positioning beneath the crinoline, managing the split crotch drawers, removing the soiled pad, positioning a fresh one, securing it to the sanitary belt, all while maintaining the appearance that nothing whatsoever was amiss. Medical records and private letters reveal that many women deliberately restricted their fluid intake on days when they'd be attending social events, trying to minimize the number of times they'd need to attempt the chamber pot maneuver. Some developed bladder infections and kidney problems as a result. Others fainted from dehydration, their corsets making it impossible to take the deep breaths that might have revived them. The physical toll of Victorian fashion extended far beyond the obvious issues of restricted breathing and compressed organs. It infiltrated every aspect of women's health, creating cascading problems that doctors of the era were often powerless to treat because acknowledging the root cause would have meant discussing the unmentionable subjects of urination, defecation, and menstruation. The household servants who managed the chamber pot system lived in their own strange world of intimate knowledge and enforced silence. In large estates, the job of emptying and cleaning chamber pots fell to the lowest-ranking servants, usually young housemaids who collected the pots during specific times of day when family members were unlikely to encounter them in the hallways. These servants moved through the house like ghosts, checking the pots in bedrooms and retiring rooms, emptying them into larger vessels called slop jars, washing them with water and vinegar, and returning them to their concealed locations. The contents of the slop jars would then be carried outside and disposed of, sometimes in designated cesspits, sometimes in designated areas of the garden, where the waste could fertilize less visible plantings. During certain periods, including various wars when saltpeter for gunpowder was in high demand, urine collection took on a grotesque commercial dimension. Government agents would actually pay for urine because it could be processed to extract the saltpeter crucial for ammunition production. Women's chamber pots became, bizarrely, a strategic resource. The collection system was managed with the same discretion as every other aspect of Victorian bodily functions. No one discussed it openly, but everyone understood that private waste was serving public purposes. The social coordination required for this system to function reveals something profound about Victorian society's collective delusion. Everyone, from the grandest lady to the lowest scullery maid, was aware of the system's existence and participated in maintaining it, yet society required that no one ever acknowledge it in conversation. Letters between friends might delicately refer to retiring for a moment, or needing to visit the retiring room, but never specified why. Etiquette manuals advised on proper behavior in dozens of social situations, but maintained absolute silence on anything related to bodily functions. The result was a society-wide conspiracy of silence, where millions of people daily engaged in elaborate rituals they'd been trained since childhood to pretend didn't exist. The psychological toll of this collective pretense particularly affected young women just entering society. Their mothers would provide hurried, embarrassed explanations of the practical mechanics, but the social and emotional dimensions, the shame attached to having a body with needs, the terror of being caught in a compromising situation, the constant vigilance required to maintain the fiction of physical purity, these things were absorbed through observation and experience. Coming-of-age letters and diaries from the period reveal young women's anxiety about managing their bodies in public spaces, their fear of accidents that would expose them to social ruin, their internalized conviction that their natural functions were somehow shameful and needed to be hidden not just from men but from other women as well. The economic impact of these clothing systems and the infrastructure required to support them was staggering. A single wealthy lady might employ a personal lady's maid whose primary job was managing the wardrobe logistics, a laundress who specialized in washing the intimate items that couldn't be seen by general household staff, and seamstresses who maintained and repaired garments damaged by the constant strain of being maneuvered around chamber pots and bodily functions. The chamber pots themselves ranged from simple pottery for servants' use to elaborate porcelain pieces painted with flowers and pastoral scenes for the family's private rooms, because even functional items had to maintain appearances. The evolution away from the crinoline and toward more practical clothing happened gradually, driven by a combination of technological change, social reform, and women's own rebellion against the constraints. The introduction of the safety bicycle in the 1880s created a crisis in women's fashion. You simply cannot ride a bicycle while wearing a 6-foot-wide steel cage. Women who wanted to participate in this new, exhilarating activity had to demand practical clothing, and their demands gradually shifted fashion norms. The bustle of the 1870s and 1880s maintained the elaborate silhouette Victorian society loved, but concentrated the volume at the back, making movement and basic functions somewhat easier. By the 1890s, simpler skirt shapes began to dominate, and by the turn of the century, the most extreme manifestations of Victorian fashion were fading into memory. But the legacy remained in women's psychology, in their relationship with their own bodies, in the internalized shame that would take generations to unlearn. Victorian attitudes toward women's bodily functions didn't disappear with the crinoline. They persisted in euphemisms that avoided naming biological realities directly, in advertising that depicted menstrual products with blue liquid instead of red, in the persistent social discomfort around acknowledging that women's bodies have needs and functions just as men's do. The chamber pot itself became a symbol of the era's contradictions. The ornate porcelain vessels decorated with delicate flowers, concealed inside beautiful furniture, essential to daily life yet never mentioned in polite company. Museums today display these items as curiosities, and visitors often laugh at their elaborate concealment systems, not fully grasping the desperation and ingenuity they represent. These weren't just toilets. They were the physical manifestation of a society that demanded women be both present and invisible, decorative and functional, refined and yet somehow free of the basic needs that define human existence. Standing in that ballroom where we began, champagne glass in hand and crisis temporarily averted, a Victorian lady would have understood something modern women can barely imagine. That grace under pressure isn't just about maintaining composure during social challenges, but about performing the most private human acts with the precision of a military operation, while an entire society pretends you're not doing anything at all. That 20 pounds of silk and steel wasn't just fashion, it was a test of endurance, creativity, and sheer stubborn determination to maintain dignity no matter what physics, biology, or architecture threw in your path. The horrible way Victorian women used the toilet in those giant dresses wasn't just horrible because of the mechanics. It was horrible because it required women to deny their own humanity every single day, to pretend their bodies didn't exist while simultaneously managing those bodies with extraordinary skill and effort. It was horrible because the same society that demanded this elaborate performance also refused to acknowledge it was happening, leaving each woman to believe she was alone in her struggles, uniquely shameful in having needs that were, in fact, universal, and perhaps most horrible of all. They succeeded. They made it look easy. The grace we admire in Victorian photography, the elegance we see in paintings of elaborately dressed women at balls and dinners, all of it was achieved by women who had mastered one of history's most challenging tests of human ingenuity, and who did it so well that we almost forgot it was a test at all.